3 decades. That's how long we're told it will take to pay off the government's surging debt following the coronavirus pandemic, according to new data from one of the world's largest accounting firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, their analysis also suggests a range of tax reforms are needed to get the budget back in the black, including, wait for this, shifting more of the financial burden onto older Australians.
After recessions and after impacts like with COVID and with previous things in the past like the GFC, it takes a long time to get economies up and running. It can take up to 10 years to get the economy back. And so over the coming period, we're going to need to get stuck into tax reform to create the longer-term impetus to have a thriving domestic economy.
Joining me now to discuss all of this is the Australian's political editor, Shanahan from Moruya on the south coast of New South Wales. Teo, down in God's country right now, Shanahan, I've got to ask you about this PwC report. They're saying there's this big imbalance between the retired and the non-retired, and that older Australians should bear the brunt when it comes to tax reform. Now, I'm going to stick up for retirees here, particularly the self-funded retirees. Mate, they've paid taxes all their lives. They've planned their retirement around the rules that are in place when they retire. Bill Shorten will tell you, do you really want to pick a fight with them? Is the government serious about taking up this PwC recommendation, do you think?
Well, Peter, I think that if they start to try and soak the retirees, they'll learn exactly the same lesson that Bill Shorten did during the last election. The simple point here is that over the years, Australian society has changed. Our whole welfare system has changed. The social contract has changed. And look, people are talking about the COVID-19 as being worse than the Depression, worse than the Spanish flu. Well, actually, it's not. It's not worse than either of those. The Spanish flu killed more people than the First World War. The Depression left people scarred for life and on the breadline for life. It created lifelong welfare dependency. And that was before there was any real welfare available. What we have now in modern Australia and in the modern world is where people are prepared to take on burdens during their lifetime to support universal medical insurance, Medicare, to support the age pension, child endowment, family allowance. All of those things are now built into the system. And that's why there was an expectation that we would have both JobKeeper and JobSeeker and now JobMaker to try and ensure that people are not left out of a lifetime of work but are able to continue to work. Now, what we've seen is what we saw during the last election was an attempt by people to say, oh, the baby boomers, yes, look, they're all rich, they're all made this money easily, they face no challenges. They seem to forget that there was actually conscription for the Vietnam War. There was a recession, there was a global financial crisis, there was an Asian financial crisis, there was a growth in terrorism. All of these things occurred during the days of the baby boomers. Now, yes, they have benefited from property rises and so on, but there was also the encouragement from governments, both Labor and Liberal governments, for people to go out and look after their own retirement so that they went out and invested their money. They saved their money. And this was before compulsory superannuation. So that the whole idea was that people were to look after themselves and take the pressure off the social security system so that people who did not have advantages and so on were able to be taken care of by that universal pension and health systems. Now, to turn around and say, oh, look, what we need to do now is soak these people, as you know, Bill Shorten said during the election campaign, they're all out there on the decks of their yachts, spending up their retirement savings. I mean, this is just unreal.
Yeah, but this is the problem. This is the problem when you have debt at these levels, when you have a huge borrowing need, and I have no issue with the Prime Minister doing what he thought was needed when we were looking at Health Armageddon. We're not looking at Health Armageddon anymore, and there has to be a recasting of the spend. We know today we're talking about this idea that you suddenly get paid by the taxpayer, the federal taxpayer, to get your pergola or your patio built out the backyard. I find all of that very, very uncomfortable for someone like me who likes government nice and small and government to get out of the way. I think we're getting into a very difficult territory here, particularly for the centre-right side of politics. But we also see these programs, reports today, JobKeeper. There's people at home, and Dominic Perrottet was getting his hair cut. He's a treasurer in New South Wales. It was getting it cut by a young British hairdresser who said, look, all my Australian colleagues, they're on JobKeeper and I don't have to work, they're going to stay home. I've got nothing, she says, so I've got to turn up. And we know a lot of the young people getting out there, getting their superannuation. Some haven't even lost their jobs, but they've accessed their superannuation. And a great story in the Australian Financial Review the other day, a guy that sells through 500 stores in Australia, very high-end sneakers, trainers. He's been run off his feet, pardon the pun, because all these young people have got a fistful of dollars and they're out there spending it. So there's a really fine line here, Dennis, between a hand up and a hand out. I think the government's under real pressure to find that line now that we're through the worst of the health crisis.
Undoubtedly, Peter. And look, I happen to know someone who worked at a high-end sneaker store. He hasn't had a job since COVID started. He's being offered one shift in 2 weeks' time. In the meantime, he's been kept in contact with his employer. But the point here is that there are different stages. The first stage was to ensure we didn't have everyone cut out of the system. And, Dominic Perrottet's hairdresser was one who didn't qualify for JobKeeper because she was a foreigner. So she kept working. The Labor Party would have had you pay her so that she didn't have to work. That was part of the coverage of trying to prevent people losing work. But no, I understand. But what we're talking about here is how we actually respond to the situation where we have to repay this debt. I mean, it's nonsense to suggest that the $60 billion mistake in job seeker should just be spent as some sort of windfall. That is complete nonsense.
Agree.
But what we have to do is recognise that we don't get carried away. And like you, I live in fear of a pink bat revival. And it was interesting to see that Lindsay Tanner, one of the gang of four, who actually determined pink bat as part of being Minister for Finance in the Rudd government, last year said two of the things that pulled Australia out of the global financial crisis were not so much what the Labor Party did. They certainly were the fact that we had zero debt to begin with, but they were immigration and our trade with China. Now, where does that leave us getting out of this particular problem? So I think that, we can't be too careful too soon to run off and criticise, the spending of all this and so forth. We've got through the first stage. We now have to work into the next stage, and picking off victims or declaring victims or picking off, milch cows isn't going to work.